Okay, good evening, everyone. And first of all, let me thank the Young Economist School, which is situated at the School of Economics at the University of Hyderabad. I'm indeed very happy to be here today. First, let me tell you a bit about myself and then I'll get on to the topic. So, I did my master's and my MPhil in economics from the University of Hyderabad. And currently I'm teaching at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. I mainly teach history of economic thought and intermediate macroeconomics. And my area of research is largely in the history of economic thought with a focus on classical economics. So today's topic is Rethinking Structural Interdependence, the Economics of François Quesnay. Now, I just want to make some brief comments and then get into the subject. So, I'm not going to analyze the current pandemic as such. And also, it is a bit like after the global financial crisis, there was a revival of interest in many universities to actually go back and look at the economics of Marx, the economics of Keynes, and the economics of Minsky. Right? So there was some sort of interest in these kinds of economists who were largely not present before. So in a similar sense, I think that this pandemic has given rise to this occasion of how do we think in a structurally interdependent manner. So just at the very outset, I would like to say that please post any comments or any queries that you might have at any point. Just post them as comments. I will respond to them only at the end of my presentation. Right? But feel free to post any comments or any questions or any queries that you might have at any point during the presentation. You don't have to wait till the very end. So let me begin by laying out the field. So the first thing is, how do we understand the economy? Now, all of us know that this notion of the economy is really an abstraction. Right? The world around us is not divided into the economy, the society, or the ecology. But we make these abstractions so as to understand our surroundings much better. But I think that it is, in this context, it's extremely important whenever we make these academic classifications to realize and remember that the economy is embedded within the larger society, which is further embedded within the larger ecology or the natural environment. I think that this is a very crucial thing, and as students of economics, I think we must always remember that. Now, let me go a bit further. The study of economics now, as most of the viewers would know, that we have divided it into microeconomics and macroeconomics. And for the interest of people who might be listening who are not economists, so microeconomics deals with individual consumers, firms, whereas macroeconomics deals with aggregates. So we talk about unemployment, you might talk about inflation, you talk about gross domestic product, you talk about savings, you talk about price level. Right? So these are the way in which we generally approach the study of the economy. So you have microeconomics and macroeconomics. Now, within microeconomics, there are further ways to understand these individual units. We might adopt a partial equilibrium framework. That is, we just take one market is given and we assume everything else remains the same, the famous ceteris paribus assumption. Or we assume general equilibrium, where you bring in all markets. All markets are put together and we find out what happens when all markets clear. By clear, it means that you're saying that the demand for every commodity or factor of production equals its supply. Now, what is the position of mainstream neoclassical economics on questions of, let's say, crisis? So it is very clear that in mainstream economics, if you assume perfect competition, there is no problem of, for instance, markets always have to clear. First and foremost, there is no structural unemployment. If workers are willing to work at the given wage rate, they will find jobs. So there's no question of real unemployment there. Now, you could, mainstream economists have, they are able to explain unemployment through various ways, and you can have temporary crisis. So this could be by they introduce some sort of rigidity into the system. So they say that the labor market is imperfect. Right? So there are some sort of rigidities there. Therefore, there can be unemployment. That is one way to think about it. Or the other way is to say that there is some sort of informational asymmetry in the economy. And this is a certain kind of rigidity which helps neoclassical economists or mainstream economists to explain unemployment. So, so we have seen that you have in the micro context, either you take an individual firm or an individual consumer, and you can put all these individual firms together, individual consumers together, you get a market. You get a market equilibrium. If you put all various kinds of markets in the economy together, you have a general equilibrium framework. Then in the macro part, what you see is you also have aggregates. So we talk about aggregate investment, we talk about aggregate income. So the question is, how are all these interrelated? So that is what we're going to come to. In this context, the economy is simply seen as some sort of an aggregate or an agglomeration of markets. So you have a market for goods and services, which has a particular price, equilibrium price and quantity. You have a market for time. I mean, if I want to call it that, how much do you prefer your present over the future? This is what is called intertemporal optimization. And it is in this market that neoclassical economists argue that you can find the rate of interest. Then you have the labor market, where the equilibrium at the point of equilibrium, you have the real wage and how much of employment is there, and this is at the full employment level. So in all these markets, there is something which is common. So I spoke about goods and services market. I spoke about the market for time, as it were, or the rate of interest. And there's also the market for labor. In all these markets, what mainstream economists have is you have an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. Right? This is fundamental. This is extremely fundamental to neoclassical economics, without which you cannot have an equilibrium position. Now, why is this important? I'll get to later, but I'm just going to highlight this here. And I must also mention that, remember that the rate of interest, which in some versions can also be said to be the rate of profit, is said to be or is understood as a reward for waiting. So if you can wait, right? So if you have the ability to wait, it means that you are going to obtain some sort of a return on that. So you can, in your minds at least, you can try to think of a distinction between the way in which neoclassical economists understand the rate of interest and other economists would understand the rate of interest. For instance, Keynes or Marx, etc. Now, what are the other features of mainstream economics? Now, you might be wondering, although this is a talk on François Quesnay, I've been spending about at least 10 minutes or so now talking about mainstream economics, because I think without an adequate appreciation of what is happening in mainstream economics, it's very difficult to realize the value of economists like Quesnay. Right? So that's the reason I'm going to spend a little bit more time and then get into it. So mainstream economic theory, if you actually look at it, especially the microeconomics part, is fundamentally a theory of exchange. It is not a theory of production. So if you take macroeconomics today, as some of you might know, there is a search for micro foundations. So you want to reduce all the macroeconomic outcomes to solid foundations in microeconomics. Now, this by itself is not a cause for concern, but you have certain ideas of, let's say, of Keynes on one side, and then you want to reduce all that to neoclassical economics. neoclassical microeconomics. Right? So there is some sort of a tension. Now, this is also the case with growth theory. It's not just micro, macro, but even growth, where they use an aggregate production function. So, any growth accounting which is done for policy reasons uses the aggregate production function, where certain simplifying assumptions are made. And what you really have is you have labor, you have capital, right? Output is seen as a function of labor and capital. So you have a market for labor, market for capital, which results in some sort of an output. But where is the structural interdependence here? So this is a question that Quesnay will have an answer for. Now, what I'm going to discuss today, especially about Quesnay, there have been other economists, more recent economists, who have also engaged with this question of structural interdependence. And I'm going to go from the most recent one until Quesnay. So the first economist of note is Luigi Pasinetti. The second economist is Vasily Leontev. The third economist is Piero Sraffa. The fourth economist is Karl Marx. And fifth in my presentation is François Quesnay. Right? So I'm going to really focus on François Quesnay. And let me also make a brief comment about all these names that I've mentioned: Pasinetti, Leontev, Sraffa, Marx, and Quesnay. All of them are approaching the question of structural interdependence from very different persuasions. All of them have different ideas or different interests in mind. For some, it is an empirical drive. So, for instance, Leontev is most famous for his input-output tables. So, he had an empirical drive. There are also theoretical drives. So, for instance, Sraffa was interested in trying to develop a consistent theory of value, or in more modern terms, a microeconomics, if you want to call it that. Whereas somebody like Pasinetti was interested in fusing Sraffa's theory with a more dynamic setup. So he falls in what is called structural economic dynamics. There have also been, for instance, for Marx, the question was how to understand capitalism. So their structural interdependence became important. For Quesnay, he also wanted to understand the economy, in particular, the role of agriculture. Again, so one of the questions that some of you might have is, I've mentioned quite a lot of recent economists. So I mentioned Pasinetti, Leontev, Sraffa. Now, why do I go all the way back to Leontev? Right? Why not choose something? So the response to that is intellectual progress is not linear. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that, so suppose there's a good idea in Quesnay. It is not the case that if I open a textbook in economics in 2020, all the good ideas of Quesnay are present here. And all the wrong ideas, in a way, are thrown out. It doesn't happen like that. There are all kinds of changes happening because of what happens in academics, in universities, in journals, in associations, in policy circles. And our own notion of what is good and bad is also tentative, in the sense that it also depends on what we know at this point in time. Right? So there is that aspect to it. So just to repeat what I just said, that intellectual progress is not linear. Now, I just want to mention a brief, it's like a digression here, which is that, so some of you, or maybe some of you might have heard about this economist, Ashok Mitra. So he wrote this book, which was on the terms of trade in the context of class, in the context of social classes. Now, this empirical notion, or this idea of terms of trade is much, the terms of trade is saying that how does the agriculture sector do relative to the manufacturing sector. You might have also heard the term terms of trade in when you study international trade, right, between exports and imports. So these are used to understand sectoral dynamics. And if I may, I could argue that the terms of trade in a way represents sectoral struggle. Right? It's a struggle between sectors. You have agriculture struggling relative to manufacturing. A bit more, if I were to go a bit more fundamental than that, you can also say that there is an embedded class struggle in all this. right? So terms of trade is a very well, it's a term which does not convey much. It does not convey the notion of struggle. It does not convey the notion of power dynamics, which is embedded. But when you put terms of trade in a richer theoretical context, then you notice that these things will come alive. Okay, so that is by way of a broad introduction of why these things are important and why uh, these ideas are difficult to embed in the existing neoclassical economics. Now, let me just start off by saying at least two important economists what they said about François Quesnay. So Piero Sraffa, who wrote in the 1960s and early 1930s, etc. So he spoke about how it is in Quesnay that we find the original picture of production as a circular process. I will explain what that means in a short while. And in fact, somebody like Karl Marx, who actually undertook a systematic study of political economy before him. So, in a way, he can be considered one of the initial or one of the first historians of economic thought because he undertook a very systematic study of political economy before him. And he refers to François Quesnay and the group of economists around him who were called Physiocrats, and the school was called Physiocracy. He called them the true founders of political economy. So there are two very important economists who ascribe significant role to Physiocrats and François Quesnay. Now, François Quesnay's book. So I just thought since the reason for not using PowerPoint actually is that at least Facebook Live does not allow both my face and the PowerPoint to be seen at the same time, and there were some issues, so we've decided to use just the video alone. And so I just want to show some books again. So I think that this is clear. So this is written in 1756, right? So that's 20 years before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was published. Right? So there is this small pamphlet where Quesnay writes on farmers. So the role of farmers is particularly important, and this is another, English translation of Quesnay's Tableau Economic. And the reason why I want to mention them is, again, it's more than 250 years old, so it's quite old. And what is it that maybe we can find a value there? So if you want to have a very Indian economy reason for it, one of it could be that the emphasis and the importance given to agriculture. The fact that significant portion of the population during that time actually engaged in agriculture. So what are the kind of dynamics that, so these are not directly there in Quesnay, but I'm just going to mention them. One is, so if you were to do an empirical analysis of, let's say, what is happening to the consumer price index for agricultural laborers versus the consumer price index for industrial workers, it represents something like a terms of trade, or it represents some sort of a structurally interdependent tension. In Quesnay, you have this sort of tension between, or the distinction is made between a peasant and a farmer. And there is also some sort of a struggle which happens between the town, which is where generally the manufactures were taking place, and the countryside, which is where agriculture was taking place. Right? So again, both of them, there is some sort of a struggle that is happening, which is captured in Quesnay's work. So again, if there was a PowerPoint, it would have been wonderful. I could show you these slides. But anyway, so let me get on with it. The tableau economic is basically, Quesnay sets up three sectors. So you have the agriculture, you have the manufacturing sector, and you also have the proprietary class, which is a class which owns land and receives rent. Right? What is the key aspect here? The key aspect, for many of you or for all of you, maybe it would seem very commonplace or commonsensical. The key aspect is that for production to go on, agriculture needs manufacturing and manufacturing needs agriculture. In other words, there is an intersectoral relationship, or agriculture and manufacturing are interdependent. So what I'm going to do now is going to talk about some of the key aspects of tableau economic and contrast it with mainstream economics. So for instance, in Quesnay, production is understood as a circular process. That is, you have outputs which are also inputs. Right? So if you want a different way of phrasing this, Sraffa's 1960 book is titled The Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. Now, this way of looking at the economy as a structurally interdependent set of sectors is very different from looking at it as let me just use the aggregate production function. So you have K, you have Y, it gives you Y. Sorry, K and L, it gives you Y. Right? So production here is seen as a linear process. You have these factors of production called capital and labor, and they give you output, which is Y. There is no interdependence in the same way as we are talking about in Quesnay. Fundamentally, there is no interdependence there. So let me just read this out. This is a nice, so just to indicate that what Quesnay is saying, this is the English translation of the French manuscript. The two classes refer to the agriculture and manufacturing. The two classes spend in part on their own products and in part mutually on the products of one another. I'll repeat that. The two classes spend in part on their own products and in part mutually on the products of one another. Right? In other words, this structural interdependence is extremely clear, and if you just Google later sometime and look at François Quesnay's tableau economic, there's a visual representation of this which makes it extremely clear. Now, in Quesnay, because land generates the surplus or the net product, he calls agriculture sector to be productive and the manufacturing sector to be sterile. Now, this does not mean that manufacturing sector is useless, because after all, if this economy has to produce agriculture, it requires the manufacturing sector, right? Now, the terminology might be slightly confusing from a modern standpoint, but one way to think of it is also that in Smith too, you have this distinction that he makes between productive labor and unproductive labor. But it is not the case that unproductive labor is not important for society. So he's talking about it from a particular standpoint of how the surplus is generated. Now, what in Quesnay's economy, what is it that drives the entire system? It is agricultural investment and profits. So Quesnay is very particular that agricultural profits should not be taxed. Only then can agriculture grow and take the entire economy along with it. So what is the nature of this intersectoral equilibrium that we see in Quesnay? He knows that if there is a growth of sectoral outputs, that is manufacturing output and agricultural output is growing, the consumption should also grow. Right? So you cannot have just production growing and consumption not growing, because then these sectors won't be in equilibrium. Right? So this economy cannot grow if there is just accumulation. In other words, there is some recognition or some vague recognition that consumption is also important. Now, I could call this a slight Keynesian position, right? But even I'm using it with a lot of caution, but still I could say that if you read that work, there is some recognition that consumption also has to grow in line with production. Now, I just want to stop here, and I want you to think about Solo's growth model, right? Which uses the Cobb-Douglas production function. And what is the role of aggregate demand in the Solo growth model? Now, if you think about it long enough, you will realize that it, in a way, follows the Say's law. Whatever is supplied will be demanded. There is no essential role for aggregate demand in the Solo growth model. So, in at least in Quesnay, the question of whether the equilibrium is stable or not, that is when agriculture sector is growing, if manufacturing sector is not growing in tandem, or the consumption does not match, the question is this intersectoral equilibrium stable? So Quesnay does not address this question really, but he recognizes that if some of these landlords, they took a part of these net product and used it for saving. He does not mention what these savings are, but somehow it escapes this circular flow of income. It's going to go out as leakages. Then it can be detrimental to your output and economic growth. So this again, some of you might see some connection between this notion and the circular flow of income notion that you might have studied in macroeconomics. So there is some relationship there. He also understands that if all these commodities that are being produced, especially the agricultural commodities, have to be consumed, where will it come from? He points out that it's going to come mainly from workers' consumption. Therefore, some key points. Workers' consumption is extremely important to ensure that agricultural prices are profitable, right, for the farmers. So it is not so the structural interdependence is not just between agricultural sector and manufacturing sector, but even within the agricultural sector, you have farmers, you have workers. Similarly, in the manufacturing too, you have at least industrial capitalists or the owners broadly, and then you have laborers. It is also essential that there is a relationship between agricultural laborers and agricultural farmers. So if there is insufficient demand for agricultural products, then what happens to the profits of the farmers? And how do we ensure that workers also have sufficient incomes? These are the questions I think that many of us are grappling with today. But looking at the structural interdependence from a standpoint of Quesnay gives you certain ways of how to bring all these things together. So now, so it's almost about, I think, 25 minutes. Now I'm going to provide some sort of conclusion. So I'm just going to make some points, and then after that, I'll respond to the questions which have already come up, and I'll also take fresh questions. Now, what can Leontief, or what can people like Leontief, Strafa, or Quesnay tell us about today's situation? One, I think, is that do we have sufficient information about the intersectoral nature of the Indian economy? So we have, for instance, we have GDP, which is now moved to a quarterly GDP because there was a demand for quarterly data. But do we have a demand for input-output data for the Indian economy? And clearly not. So we don't have sufficient data to actually understand the intersectoral relationships that exist in the Indian economy. And so one is an empirical question about the availability of data. The second, a sort of inspiration from Quesnay can be that one, if you want to have a good theory of prices, you can look at Strafa's work, which also is tied to Quesnay's work. Now, or if you're interested in the question of economic dynamics, it is accumulation and growth, you can look at the work of Marx and Passionate. So just because these authors did not write in 2020 or in 2019, it does not mean that their ideas are irrelevant. And I think that this is a crucial point. So I'll just repeat that again. There are two broad ways in which I think Quesnay's work is relevant today and should be relevant. One is in the empirical context that we want more information, much more detailed information about intersectoral relationships for the Indian economy. Right? This is not just about quantities, but it is also about wages. So what is the kind of, how much does a farmer make in terms of agriculture profits, and how much does a worker make, right? Agricultural laborer make? Right? These are distinct. So let me, one is that. The other one is the theoretical aspect of it, which is that you want to have a good theory of prices, which is in contrast to the neoclassical theory of price, which is built on the theory of exchange, which is built on assumptions of scarcity. And it is really a theory of exchange. So for something like that, you can look to, or you can look to Strafa's work. And for economic dynamics, you can look at works of Karl Marx and Passionate. Now, I want to probe a little further. So, why is it that we do not have adequate input-output data? I just have some preliminary hypothesis, and some of you might have answers to this. One is certainly the role of theory. So, if you have a particular theory, like let's say the Solos growth model, there is no reason to demand for input-output data, because all you need is a data for at the level of the capital market, however you define that. You want to have a labor market, you want to have data for the labor market at the aggregate, and you want GDP data. So there is no real need which is generated from the theoretical side to the empirical side. So that is one aspect in which I think the theory is extremely important. The second is about the nature of the academia itself, that sometimes it is fashionable. I mean, at a point in time, there was a lot of work on input output in India and elsewhere, but now it is not so. Right? So now you have a lot of microeconometric work which calls for a different kind of data. So what is fashionable in academia today certainly has a role to play in what kind of demand, what kind of data is being demanded as well. Then, of course, what is fashionable in policy today? Right? They also have an impact on what kind of data is being demanded. So, for instance, because random controlled trials are currently in fashion, people like to see that kind of data. Right? So, it also depends on all these things where academic fashion, policy fashion, what is fashionable in statistics. Right? So all these have a role to play in which partly explaining, I think, why there is insufficient input-output data. But there is another thing. So when I mentioned about François Quesnay, I mentioned that he does not really address the question of stability of equilibrium. There are two ways of thinking about it today, or two extreme ways of thinking about it. So one is to think that the market will take care of this intersectoral equilibrium and we don't have to worry about it. The other one is to say that, well, the market won't take care of it. We need to have some sort of government planning. Right? So if government planning is required, you need to have information. But if you think that it is not necessary to have planning, then you don't need this kind of data. Right? So I think that it's also important to keep in mind what are the broad tendencies of individual theories as well, and its role to the role of the government, whether it should intervene or whether it should withdraw. So let me go a little bit more, throw some questions open, really, not answer them. In the context of intersectoral relationships, in agriculture, I think that we need to have more information on the supply chain. Right? So from point to point, from the actual producer to the consumer, the end consumer, what is the nature in which value is being added at every step? That is just one, because you also want to know how the landowners are doing, right? What at this point in time, how are they surviving? You also want to know what is happening to the farmers. And again, laborers are not a single homogeneous category. And as all of you will know, that you have formal sector, you have informal, and in today's context, you have migrant labor, right? Which is probably the most important group of laborers that we are talking about today. There is also the division of laborers which are based on caste, which are based on gender. So this kind of a structure, sectoral or a structural interdependence framework, what I think it really brings to the fore is a kind of sectoral struggle. It really talks about a sectoral struggle, but as I said before, if you were to go deeper into it, you're also seeing some sort of a class struggle, and not just class struggle in the context of India and other countries. We can also see, or we can also uh, construct a caste struggle, a gender struggle. All these can be embedded in this broad structural, this idea of structural interdependence, which escapes most of conventional economics or mainstream economics. Right? So, in that sense, this tradition provides an alternative conceptual framework. So, you have a theory of price coming from Straffa. You have a theory of dynamics, which comes from people like Karl Marx or Passanati. You have an empirical way of putting all this information together in the work of Leontief. Right? So you can also bring in other people, but I'm not mentioning them. But it is clear that if you put all these theorists who have spoken about structural interdependence in the context of price, in the context of output determination, and in the context of growth, you can get a coherent alternative to this neoclassical economics, which really does not take into account structural interdependence. Now, it is not, by all this, I don't mean to say that mainstream economics does not recognize questions of gender or questions of caste. They do, right? They do. And if you see a lot of the recent work, they speak a lot about strictly what are considered non-economic factors. But there's no real theory behind any of this. Right? So it's mainly, okay, I think this is important, so let me study it. So it's, in that sense of the term, one could call it, it's more ad hoc in nature. It really depends on the individual researcher. And I think, if I may offer an explanation for this, I think part of the reason is this attempt to become more practical. I think across universities, students also, we notice that students, I mean, it is right to think that we want to learn things which we can apply. But in this quest to become more and more practical, I think that we have forgotten some of the conceptual foundations of economics, or how to think about these matters in a much more disciplined way. And I would like to end by this particular quotation from a psychologist called Kurt Lewin. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. It's not exactly how he said it. He says that there is nothing so practical as a good theory. Let me repeat that. There is nothing so practical as a good theory. Thank you. And I think I'll stop here. So if you have any questions, I'll respond. Let me read the questions and then I'll respond to them on video. Okay, so there's a question on how old is that the Quesnay pamphlet. So the first one that I showed you was 1756, and the tableau économique, which I showed you next, was published in several editions. The first edition was published in 1758. So I think those are the only questions that I've seen so far, but I'll wait in case there are further questions. Okay, so there is a question on a good introductory book on history of economic thought. Okay, so let me just do one thing. I'm just going to reply to that probably, because that might be easier. So there's a nice, if it is for an introductory book, there's a nice book by Heinz Kutz. I think it's called Economic Thought, A Brief History. I'm just going to type that out. So this is what I just mentioned is an introductory book, but if you're interested in slightly more advanced books, so you can look at this author, Alessandro Roncaglia, who has written several books on the history of economic thought. They are a bit more technical, in the sense they go a bit more into the details, but the initial book that I mentioned, I think, is a good introduction. It's a lively introduction. So, and the Roncaglia book actually looks into a lot of, it also connects with what is happening today. So how some of these ideas have fallen out of textbooks. Right. So sometimes, the questions to ask is, although, for instance, somebody like Marx spoke a lot on theory of value, why is Marx not taught or why is Marx not a part of microeconomics textbooks? Right? So that's one kind of a question. Now, of course, one can say that Marx was not writing in the 1900s, but there's a similar question like that would be, why is Duesenberry's relative income hypothesis missing in textbooks now? So there is something to be said about how a lot of ideas that are generated do not sort of translate into wider knowledge because of the way in which textbooks are written, who writes these textbooks, how syllabuses are written. And I think in all these contexts, I think as students, all of you can play a very important role. So what I'll also do is once this live thing is over, I'll send at least 2 or 3 references in case some of you are interested in reading more about Quesnay's work. Right? So I'll put up those links in the comment section. So I think I'll wait for maybe some 2-3 minutes and then maybe we can close this session. Yeah, I think that probably one of the disadvantages of Facebook Live is that I can't see the audience. I think one of the best parts of any talk or any discussion is really seeing face to face. But I think that this particular platform is not conducive to that kind of an engagement. Okay, so there's one question. So there's this question which is about the fact that although the contribution of agricultural sector to GDP is less, but in terms of employment, it's quite high, and so therefore, how does Quesnay, or how can we bring Quesnay to inform us of some of these issues? It's interesting because I didn't mention this point, but in Quesnay and the Physiocrats, so they recognized a very crucial thing. As consumers of agricultural commodities, we experience variation generally only in prices. So we generally are able to get, in usual times, are able to get the kind of quantities that we want. The price variation happens, only the price variation happens. Whereas if you think about farmers, right, they experience variation not just in prices, because price of inputs can change, the price of raw materials can change, the price of the outputs can change, but also the quantity can change. Because agriculture fundamentally, at least in India, it's heavily dependent on the availability of irrigation. Right? So the kind of precarity or the kind of uncertainty that characterizes Indian agriculture, particularly in terms of with respect to prices and quantities, is significantly higher than what as consumers we face. And unless there is some sort of crisis situation because of the long value chains, and because maybe we don't see the agricultural vendor who can tell us about the quality or where it is from, because there are just so many chains. I think that we've also forgotten about this kind of structural interdependence that exists. I think that today, the kind of developments that happen makes it easier for us consumers also to forget it. And one is what is happening, in the consumers, not necessarily economists, but then also within how economics is studied, there is a sort of not forgetting really, but they don't seem to engage with these questions in a structural way. And that's partly because we have forgotten the contributions made by economists like Quesnay or Marx or Staffa or Passanetti. And just as an add to, I'm adding to that point. So when Quesnay was writing, two things. Quesnay did not think that there was any kind of a supply side constraint, especially with respect to labor or with respect to land. Right? And I think that's crucial because mainstream economics or mainstream neoclassical economists generally assume that the economy is close to the full employment, if not at full employment. So I think this is a significant difference, and in fact, Keynes would argue that the general theory is one of unemployment, and the general situation in an economy is not one of full employment. Whereas still, um, neoclassical economics in various ways still, assumes this kind of a full employment position. And I think that I'll probably just make one more point, which is to say that one of the things that comes out of the structural interdependence is that both the sectors need each other, but what happens in one sector can have a positive or negative impact on the other sector, right? Which is what terms of trade also indicate. And there is a struggle. So there is some sort of a struggle which is embedded in this notion of structural interdependence too. But again, if you take the mainstream version, which is your since I've used the solo growth theory before, let me just mention that you have the aggregate production function, and which generally is based on the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. So, where under conditions of competition, the worker is paid the marginal product of labor, and the rate of profit equals the marginal product of capital. It is a harmonious explanation of income distribution and of general society. The society is in harmony. There is no recognition of power differentials, really fundamental difference of power or structural difference of power. There's no real mention of a struggle. So fundamentally, these kinds of this tradition, which I've just mentioned, um, Marx, Staffa, Quesnay, they are coming. They are trying to understand the economy from a very different position, and this vision on conceptualization is significantly different from what you see in textbooks today. Right? In textbooks today, there is no real sense in which you can see power. Okay, I think I'll wait for another 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, I think that's all for now. As I said before, I'll post some links which are relevant to what I've spoken about as comments. So if some of you are interested, you can always go to those links and access further reading. So thank you all once again for. Okay, so just there's another question right when I was going to say thank you. Yeah, so There is no such recognition of. Also, I mean, at that time, manufacturing sector was not. I mean, it was in its nascent stages. Really, it's also the emergence of capitalism as we know it. So I think that there is also that reason in which that kind of price take competition, non-competition, those kinds of recognition is not to be found in Quesnay's work. But so if you want to construct such a model, you can construct it, as I said. So if you use something like a Leontief version, which would be more empirical, or if you want to use Sraffa's theory of price or his price system, you can construct something like that, where you have some elements of competition and some elements of oligopoly. And there has been work done in this area. So again, I'll probably try to send you some links on that. Okay, I'll wait for another minute because I think maybe people are thinking about questions. So I'll wait for 1 or 2 more minutes. Okay, I think let me say thank you again. It was good to engage with some of you at least over the questions, and thank you once again to the Young Economist School at the University of Hyderabad for inviting me. Again, it would have been wonderful to come to the campus again, but at the time being, I think that this was a great opportunity. Thank you.